Welcome back to the show. Today, we are conducting a comprehensive examination of a very specific era, but we aren't just looking at it as a collection of years or a list of songs.
We are treating this period as the first chapter in the biography of the modern music industry.
Exactly. We are talking about the years 1980 through 1989. Now, usually when people discuss this era, the conversation devolves pretty quickly into caricatures.
The focus tends to be on the neon aesthetics and the hairspray.
Right, the synthesizers and all of that. But if you actually dig into the documentation and the history for yourself, you realize that those aesthetic choices were actually symptoms of a much larger structural change.
It was the decade of corporatization.
It really was. This was the moment the music business stopped being a cottage industry and became a global industrial complex. It laid the groundwork for everything we see in the industry up to today's date.
It is the moment the infrastructure was built.
Yep.
If you look at the critical analysis from that time, particularly the work of Robert Christgau in his Guide to the 80s, the distinction he draws is vital.
I'm glad you brought up Christgau because his framework is essential for this analysis.
He argues that prior to this era, music was viewed primarily as an art form that happened to be sold. But in the 1980s, the industry shifted to viewing music as intellectual property and capital first.
And the art was just the delivery mechanism for the capital.
Correct. The art served the capital.
That concept, music as capital, is really the lens we need to use for this entire conversation. It explains almost every trend we are going to look at today. It wasn't just about selling a record anymore.
It was about the consolidation of power.
Exactly. It was about who owned the music. By the time we get to the end of the decade, the landscape of who actually owned these properties had completely changed. You had this massive wave of international corporatization.
The consolidation was rapid. By 1990, if you looked at the 6 dominant American record companies, only 2 of them were actually headquartered in the United States.
That is a staggering shift.
It is. The rest had been acquired by massive media conglomerates based in Europe and Japan. The executives running these companies were operating with a new philosophy.
They were acting locally but thinking globally.
Yes, they were signing local acts, but they were looking at how to market a product simultaneously in Germany, Australia, Venezuela, and Indonesia.
And to do that, they developed a brand new marketing machine. Christgau had this great term for it. He called it the cross-promotional hookah.
It is a unique descriptor.
It's a strange image, I know, but it fits perfectly. It refers to how the industry started integrating absolutely everything. You didn't just release an album anymore.
You released a soundtrack album that was tied to a blockbuster movie.
Right, and then that movie was promoted by a music video.
Which was essentially a commercial for both the song and the movie.
Exactly. And then you launched a tour that was sponsored by a major soda company or a beer brand, and you sold merchandise at that tour. All of these things fed into each other in this massive loop.
It was the birth of the 360-degree model. The music video is the key component there.
Because it changed how we consume the product.
It transformed the song from an auditory experience into a visual commodity. It turned the artist into what sociologists would call a commodity fetish.
Meaning the image of the artist became just as valuable, if not more valuable, than the actual music itself.
Precisely.
So in this new environment, success gets completely redefined. It's not just about being influential or cool in an underground club. It's about certification.
It is about moving units on a global scale.
And if we are going to talk about moving units and the rise of the megastar, there is really only one place we can start this analysis.
We must discuss Michael Jackson.
We have to. The sheer scale of his success is, well, it is almost hard to comprehend now.
The statistical data regarding Michael Jackson in the 1980s is difficult to believe by modern standards. Thriller, which was released in 1982, became the best-selling album of all time.
Just massive numbers.
During the decade of the 80s alone, it sold 25 million copies. The total sales are now over 65 million.
But the crucial point here for you listening at home isn't just the sheer number of records sold. It's that Thriller literally changed the economic model of the record label itself.
Before Thriller, major labels relied on a volume of moderate hits to sustain their business.
Right. They threw a lot of things at the wall.
After Thriller, every major label was looking for their own blockbuster. They wanted one massive album that could sustain the company's entire bottom line for a year or two.
And Michael didn't stop with Thriller. In 1987, he released Bad. And while it didn't sell quite as many total copies as Thriller, it did something arguably more impressive from a radio format standpoint.
It was the first album in history to generate 5 #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100.
That is complete market saturation. You could not turn on a radio in 1987 or 1988 without hearing a song from that album. It was everywhere.
We also have to discuss the distribution mechanism and how he changed it. Yes. Michael Jackson was the catalyst for breaking the racial barrier on MTV.
This is a vital piece of the history. Before the release of Beat It and Billie Jean, African-American artists were systematically excluded from heavy rotation on that channel.
The programmers argued that their format was strictly rock, which they coded as a white demographic.
But Jackson's success was just so undeniable that it literally forced them to change the programming format.
He did not just participate in the industry, he reshaped how it was distributed,
He spent 27 weeks at #1 during the 1980s.
which earned him the title of Artist of the Decade from numerous institutions.
Now, if Jackson was the king of pop, operating in this upper stratosphere of mass appeal, then Prince was the prolific genius operating on a completely different frequency.
Prince was a primary architect of the sound of the decade.
He absolutely was, and he was obviously a massive star in his own right. I mean, you look at Purple Rain, which went 13 times platinum in 1999, was huge. But I think what defines Prince in the 80s is his sheer work ethic. He was an industry unto himself.
Often without the public realizing his full reach, he was writing and producing hits for other artists constantly.
Right. He wrote I Feel For You for Chaka Khan.
Which won a Grammy for Best R&B Song.
He wrote Sugar Walls for Sheena Easton. And he wrote Manic Monday for the Bangles. I think that is the one that always surprises people.
It is structurally a perfect pop song.
It is. And then you listen closely and you realize that it has a very distinct Prince melody.
He also wrote Nothing Compares to You,
which Sinead O'Connor obviously had the massive hit with in the 90s.
but Prince wrote and recorded it in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Furthermore, he created entire personas and bands like Vanity Six and Morris Day. In the time, he was controlling the output of multiple acts simultaneously.
It was unprecedented control. Then you have the female forces who really define the era. Madonna is the obvious counterpart to Jackson here.
If Jackson broke the barrier on MTV, Madonna established the medium's permanent architecture.
She understood the visual medium better than anyone else at the time. She wasn't just making promotional videos, she was making short films that defined her entire aesthetic from album to album.
Madonna treated the music video as a primary art form. Her album True Blue was the best-selling female album of the 1980s.
But her critical evolution is what I find really interesting. She started as a fairly straightforward dance pop act.
However, by the time she released Like a Prayer in 1989, she had secured major critical acclaim. Rolling Stone described that album as being as close to art as pop music gets.
She proved that you could be a commercial juggernaut and a critical darling at the exact same time. Her domination of the charts with hits like a Virgin and Papa Don't Preach was absolute.
While Madonna dominated the visual and cultural landscape, Whitney Houston dominated the vocal landscape.
Entirely. Her success was built on the sheer, undeniable power of her voice.
Whitney Houston's statistics demonstrate a different kind of dominance. She was the best-selling female R&B artist of the decade.
Her second album, simply titled Whitney, was a major milestone.
It was the first album by a female artist to debut at #1 on the Billboard 200.
But the record that really stands out for me is her run of singles.
She achieved 7 consecutive #1 songs on the Billboard Hot 100.
That is a level of consistency that no one else matched during that time. We also absolutely have to mention Janet Jackson.
Her impact was substantial.
I feel like in the retrospective analysis of the 80s, she sometimes gets overshadowed by Michael or Madonna, but her impact on the actual sound of pop production was massive.
Her 1986 album Control was a definitive pivot point.
Working with producers Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, she basically fused funk, disco, rap, and industrial sounds.
It resulted in a very aggressive, highly polished pop sound. Then in 1989, she released Rhythm Nation 1814.
That album is entirely unique in chart history.
It produced #1 hits in 3 separate calendar years. It also produced 7 top 5 hit singles from a single album.
Which is a record that still stands to this day. There were other pop titans, of course. You had Bruce Springsteen with Born in the USA, which produced a record-tying 7 hit singles.
Lionel Richie and Diana Ross topped the charts for 9 weeks with Endless Love.
So that was the top of the pyramid. That was the megastar tier. But while they were selling tens of millions of records, the rock world was heavily fracturing.
It split into distinct subcultures.
Subcultures that barely acknowledged each other's existence. On one side, you had the massive commercial machine of glam metal.
Glam metal, or hair metal, peaked primarily between 1986 and 1992.
This was the visual aesthetic of the 80s taken to its absolute logical extreme.
You saw this with bands like Motley Crue, Poison, and Cinderella.
Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet, probably the absolute commercial peak of this specific sound.
Def Leppard's Hysteria is another key example. The production in that album was so polished it sounded almost robotic.
It was the era of the power ballad. The formula was simple. You write a heavy up-tempo rock song for the arena, and then you write a slow, emotional ballad to get on the radio and MTV.
It was an effective formula. These bands were filling stadiums consistently.
And Van Halen somehow managed to span the entire decade.
They transitioned from their original singer, David Lee Roth, to Sammy Hagar in the mid-'80s without losing commercial momentum. That is a statistically rare feat.
Extremely rare. And then, right at the tail end of the decade, Guns N' Roses appeared. They are an interesting case because they had the look of glam metal. The hair, the clothes, but the sound was much grittier.
It was far more blues-influenced.
They really bridged the gap between the polished pop metal and the sleazier, more dangerous side of rock. But while the hair bands were partying on the Sunset Strip, there was a much darker, much faster movement happening completely underground.
This was the emergence of thrash metal.
Thrash was the exact antithesis of glam. It wasn't about looking good or trying to get a ballad on the radio.
It prioritized technical proficiency and extreme speed.
This scene was defined by what is known as the Big Four in America.
Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax, and Megadeth.
They took the raw speed of hardcore punk and combined it with the technical heavy guitar work of British heavy metal. And this wasn't just an American phenomenon.
It was a global underground network. In Brazil, Sepultura was rising up, mixing thrash with tribal rhythms.
And in Europe?
In Germany, there was the Big Teutonic Four, Creator, Destruction, Sodom, and Tankard. They played an even more aggressive style that directly influenced later extreme metal genres.
What is truly remarkable is that Metallica, a band that started in this very abrasive, very anti-commercial underground scene, eventually broke through to the mainstream by the late 80s.
They demonstrated that mainstream success did not strictly require makeup and power ballads, provided the fan base was loyal enough to drive sales.
Exactly. Then there was the third major stream of rock, the music that was being heavily played on college radio stations.
This marks the transition from post-punk to what was eventually categorized as alternative rock.
This is the scene that really laid the crucial groundwork for everything that happened in the 1990s.
This sector operated in a completely different infrastructure from the major labels.
It was driven almost entirely by independent labels. Labels like SST, Twin Tone, and Discord.
It relied on a do-it-yourself touring ethic.
Bands just getting in a van and driving across the country to play tiny clubs for 50 people. REM is the ultimate breakout success story of this specific world.
Their debut album, Murmur, in 1983, entered the top 40.
Which was a massive signal to the industry that this underground college rock actually had serious commercial viability. You also had bands like Husker Du and The Replacements.
They integrated the raw energy of punk rock with traditional melody and song structure.
And you had these fascinating regional scenes developing all over the place. In Los Angeles, there was the Paisley Underground with bands like the Bangles before they went fully pop.
In New Zealand, the Dunedin sound emerged, featuring bands like The Clean.
By the late 80s, the direct precursors to grunge were already highly active. Pixies, Sonic Youth, Jane's Addiction.
They were releasing records in the late 80s that sounded completely distinct from mainstream radio formats.
They were building the alternative nation that would eventually explode in 1991. We also need to take a moment to talk about the term new wave.
The definition of that term evolved significantly.
Because by the mid-80s, that term had really morphed into something else entirely. In the late 70s, new wave meant nervous, intellectual, art school bands like Talking Heads.
By the early 80s, it primarily denoted Duran Duran and the Second British Invasion.
But around 1983, the entire industry shifted. The term new wave started to quickly fade out.
The industry began using terms like new music or synth-pop.
There is an interesting theory by the critic Andrew Collins regarding this. He argues that the breakup of the Jam and the formation of Duran Duran effectively marked the death of the original new wave concept.
It ceased being about a specific punk-adjacent attitude and became entirely about a specific synthesizer-driven sound.
Speaking of that sound, let's look at how rhythm itself evolved in the 80s. This was a pivotal decade for R&B, and of course, it was the golden era of hip-hop.
In R&B, there was a clear bifurcation in the market.
On one side, you had the Quiet Storm format.
This was a radio format championed by artists such as Luther Vandross, Anita Baker, and Sade.
It was highly sophisticated, very adult-oriented, and focused intensely on high production values and romantic themes.
On the other side of that division was the invention of New Jack Swing.
This is a sound that completely defines the late 80s for me.
New Jack Swing was pioneered by Teddy Riley around 1986.
He completely revolutionized R&B production. He took these classic soul vocals and complex harmonies, but he put them over very aggressive swung hip-hop beats.
He utilized drum machines programmed with a very specific, sharp sound profile.
He applied this production style to artists like Bobby Brown, Keith Sweat, and his own group, Guy. It perfectly bridged the gap between traditional R&B and the rising force of hip-hop.
And hip-hop itself was undergoing a major maturation phase.
In the early 80s, it was largely treated as party music, but then the subject matter shifted dramatically.
The turning point is widely recognized as the release of The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five in 1982.
That song proved to the world that hip-hop could be a serious vehicle for social commentary. It talked openly about the severe stress of living in the inner city.
The thematic shift opened the door for groups like Public Enemy later in the decade.
Their song Black Steel and the Hour of Chaos is a prime example of hip-hop functioning as a sharp political weapon. We also saw the technical innovation of the human beatbox during this time.
Artists like Dougie Fresh and Biz Markie pioneered the technique of using the mouth and throat to simulate drum machines and turntable scratching.
It was a purely organic human way to create the synthetic electronic sounds that were dominating the music at the time.
By the late 80s, acts like Run DMC, the Beastie Boys, NWA, LL Cool J, and Salt and Peppa were dominant.
Hip-hop had fully established itself as a massive commercial force. It was no longer considered a passing fad. It was a foundational pillar of the modern industry.
If we isolate electronic music specifically, the 1980s produced the two foundational pillars of modern global dance music:
House and techno. And it's fascinating because they emerged from two very different American cities under very different circumstances.
Chicago originated house music. It emerged in the early 1980s from the remnants of disco.
It was deeply, deeply influenced by soul and funk music.
Key figures like DJs Ron Hardy and Lil Louie began stripping down disco records, looping sections, and significantly boosting the bass and drum frequencies.
The Hot Mix 5 radio shows in Chicago were absolutely essential in spreading the sound across the city. It was incredibly physical music. It was music made specifically for the body on the dance floor.
A few hundred miles away in Detroit, techno was being developed.
And Detroit techno came from a completely different headspace.
It was pioneered by a trio known as the Belleville Three.
Juan Atkins, Kevin Saunderson, and Derek May.
They were high school friends in Belleville, Michigan. Their primary influences were European electronic music, particularly Kraftwerk.
But they were living in the Detroit area, a city that was rapidly becoming post-industrial. Their environment was changing, and their music reflected that.
The music sounded futuristic, highly mechanical, and intentionally alien.
It wasn't just straightforward party music. It was a sonic reflection of a highly technological future. Both of these genres, house and techno, would eventually be exported heavily to Europe and become massive global phenomena that dictate pop music to this day. Let's pivot our analysis to country music now. The 80s were an absolute roller coaster for the country genre.
It experienced a massive commercial boom followed by a significant crash.
The early 80s were defined by the urban cowboy era. This was largely driven by the 1980 film Urban Cowboy, starring John Travolta. Suddenly, country music was at the absolute center of pop culture.
Artists like Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton were releasing records that were structurally pop songs with a slight country inflection.
They were crossing over to the mainstream pop charts constantly, but the market became incredibly saturated with this sound. The core traditional country audience started to feel alienated by the pop polish.
By 1985, the New York Times published an article featuring a headline that explicitly asked if country music was dead.
That is a harsh assessment for a major publication to make, but the music industry always has a way of correcting itself when the pendulum swings too far.
The industry correction was the neo-traditionalist movement.
Starting right around 1986, a new wave of artists emerged who completely rejected the pop crossover polish. They went back to the roots of the genre.
They reintroduced honky-tonk elements, fiddles, and pedal steel guitars.
Randy Travis really became the face of this movement. Dwight Yoakam and George Strait were also central, foundational figures.
Even veteran artists like Reba McEntire adapted their sound to align with this return to traditional roots.
We also saw the release of the Trio album by Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris.
That was a purely acoustic traditional recording that won a Grammy, proving the commercial viability of the traditional sound.
There was also a deeply tragic what-if story in this era of country music regarding Keith Whitley.
Keith Whitley was widely considered the most promising vocal talent of the neo-traditionalist movement.
He had an incredible classic voice and a very deep understanding of the genre's history. Tragically, he died of alcohol poisoning in 1989, just as he was on the verge of becoming a massive superstar.
Many historians view his death as a major loss that altered the artistic trajectory of country music in the subsequent decade.
And we definitely cannot ignore the rise of the country bands. Alabama completely changed the game for country groups.
Alabama was named the Artist of the Decade by the Academy of Country Music.
They operated like a traditional rock band. They played their own instruments on stage and wrote their own songs, but they played a style of country music that was heavily mixed with Southern rock.
They sold millions of albums and established the template for the highly successful country bands of the 1990s.
The Oak Ridge Boys and the Statler Brothers also maintained huge, consistent popularity during this time. Now, I want to spend some real time on the global picture. We started this conversation by talking about international corporatization.
The 1980s was the decade where the music industry truly connected the world into a single market.
Exactly. Let's look at Europe first.
Europe, particularly the UK, was the stronghold of the synthesizer. The UK was exporting synth-pop to the rest of the global market.
You had massively successful groups like Pet Shop Boys, Depeche Mode, and Eurythmics.
These acts were defining the sonic texture of the decade globally. It is also necessary to note the statistical dominance of Phil Collins.
He was everywhere.
If you combine his solo releases and his work with the band Genesis, he had more top 40 hits on the Billboard Hot 100 in the 1980s than any other artist.
That is an incredible statistic given the competition. And then you had George Michael.
George Michael successfully executed a transition from the teen-oriented Papa Wham to a serious adult solo artist.
His album Faith sold 25 million copies worldwide. He was one of the very few British artists who could genuinely compete directly with Michael Jackson and Madonna in terms of raw commercial power and cultural impact.
The decade also saw linguistic barriers breaking down on the charts.
Falco is a perfect example here.
Falco, an Austrian artist, managed to get a German-language song, Rock Me Amadeus, to the #1 position in the U.S. in 1986.
That is an incredibly rare feat in the American market. And from Ireland, you had U2 growing from a scrappy post-punk band into the biggest, most important stadium rock band in the world.
Additionally, Enya achieved a major breakthrough in 1988 with her album Watermark,
introducing a totally unique Celtic ambient sound directly to the mainstream pop charts. Now let's shift our focus to Latin America. This is a region that saw massive foundational political and cultural shifts in the 80s, and the music reflected that reality.
In Argentina, the return to a democratic government fueled a massive rock explosion.
Soda Stereo is undoubtedly the key band here.
They are frequently cited as the most influential rock band of the 1980s in the Spanish-speaking world.
They mixed new wave and post-punk influences with a very distinct Latin identity. And then Brazil had a truly historic moment in 1985.
The Rock in Rio Festival.
This wasn't just a large concert, it was a profound cultural milestone for the country.
It drew an estimated 1 million attendees. It marked the symbolic end of the military dictatorship and the opening of the Brazilian market to major international touring acts.
It also provided a massive platform for domestic bands. You had an explosion of Brazilian rock starting around 1981 with bands like Blitz and Legião Urbana.
They were writing lyrics about the harsh reality of urban life in Brazil, and they were selling millions of records domestically.
In Mexico, the rock scene had a much harder time initially getting off the ground.
The early 1980s in Mexico are frequently referred to as the lost decade for rock music.
This was due to strict government restrictions and outright censorship of the youth culture. But by the late 80s, the movement known as rock in your language began to truly take hold.
Bands like Caifans and Maldita Vecindad began blending traditional rock instrumentation with distinct Mexican cultural elements.
And in the broader tropical music world, salsa was undergoing a major stylistic change.
Salsa transitioned from the hard, street-focused style of the 70s to a subgenre known as salsa romantica.
This was a much softer, highly polished sound that focused almost entirely on love and relationships.
It was controversial among genre purists, but it proved to be commercially massive.
Let's travel to Asia. The Japanese music market in the 80s was an absolute economic powerhouse.
It was the second largest music market in the world during that period.
Japan was in the middle of an unprecedented economic boom, commonly referred to as the bubble economy. And the music perfectly reflected that high level of optimism and extreme wealth.
This era birthed the genre now categorized as city pop.
This was sophisticated, adult-oriented pop music that mixed American funk, disco, and smooth, soft rock.
Artists like Tatsuro Yamashita and Henri were producing incredibly high-fidelity recordings.
It was music explicitly designed for affluent lifestyles, driving convertibles along the coast and listening on very expensive high-end stereo systems. It's absolutely fascinating because city pop has experienced this massive resurgence recently.
It has. Since around 2019, internet algorithms and the microgenre known as vaporwave have reintroduced city pop to a global audience.
Reissue campaigns like the Pacific Breeze compilations have made artists like Maria Takakuchi incredibly famous to a modern generation that wasn't even born when the original music was recorded. Japan also had the idol phenomenon during this time.
The 1980s are considered the golden age of idols in Japan.
These were primarily teenage stars like Seiko Matsuda and Akina Nakamori, who were managed meticulously by powerful talent agencies.
They maintained strict dominance over the domestic charts and television broadcasting.
And on the rock side of the Japanese industry, you had the emergence of the visual kei movement, specifically with the band X Japan.
They combined the theatrical visual aesthetic of glam metal with the extreme speed of thrash metal, while incorporating classical piano sections.
It was a uniquely Japanese synthesis of global styles. Also in Asia, Indonesia developed a highly polished sound.
Known as pop creative.
It was studio-driven, sophisticated pop, heavily influenced by Western jazz fusion and city pop, championed by artists like Fariz RM. Finally, we have to look at Oceania. Australia and New Zealand were punching way above their weight class on the global stage in the 80s.
Australia produced INXS.
Their album Kick was a massive global smash, driven by the intense charisma of Michael Hutchence. Need You Tonight went all the way to #1 in the US.
You also saw the launch of Kylie Minogue's career.
Her cover of The Locomotion became the absolute highest-selling Australian single of the entire decade.
Men at Work also achieved massive breakout success in the early 80s.
Winning the Grammy for Best New Artist. And New Zealand produced a song that I honestly think stands as one of the very best of the decade, regardless of origin.
Crowded House, which was formed by Neil Finn after the dissolution of Split Enz.
Their song Don't Dream It's Overreached #2 in the US market. It proved definitively that truly great, enduring songwriting could travel from the most isolated places on Earth and resonate globally. It remains an absolute standard today. So we have covered the globe. We have covered the splintering of the genres. When you step back and look at the complete biography of the 1980s up to today's date, what is the core summary?
The summary is that the 1980s effectively built the infrastructure we operate within today. It transitioned the music industry from a loose collection of regional art-focused scenes into a framework of global corporate dominance.
It established the technological foundation for modern electronic dance music. It birthed the golden age of hip-hop.
And it created the definitive visual language of pop stardom that remains the industry standard.
The core concepts of the modern industry, the artist functioning as a brand, the live tour functioning as a sponsored franchise, and the song functioning strictly as intellectual property, all of that was codified during this specific decade.
It finalized the modern blueprint.
It truly was the decade where the music got louder, the aesthetics got bigger, and the underlying business got incredibly serious. It has been an absolute pleasure walking through this history with you. Thanks for listening.